Chapter 3 The Sailing of the King. What made Scrub look so dingy, and Jill too, if she could have only seen herself, was the splendor of their surroundings. I had better describe them at once. Through a cleft in the mountains which Jill had seen far inland as she approached the land, the sunset light was pouring over a level lawn. On the far side of the lawn, its weather vanes glittering in the light, rose a many-towered and many-turreted castle, the most beautiful castle Jill had ever seen. On the near side was a quay of marble, and, moored to this ship. A tall ship with high forecastle and high poop, gilded and crimson, with a great flag in the masthead, and many banners waving from the decks, and a row of shields, bright as silver, along the bulwarks. The gangplank was laid to her, and at the foot of it, just ready to go on board, stood an old man. He wore a rich mantle of scarlet, which opened in front to show his silver mail shirt. There was a thin circlet of gold in his head. His beard, white as wool, fell nearly to his waist. He stood straight enough, leaning on one hand on the shoulder of a richly dressed lord who seemed younger than himself. But you could see he was very old and frail. He looked as if a puff of wind could blow him away, and his eyes were watery. Immediately in front of the king, who had turned round to speak to his people before going on board the ship, there was a little chair on wheels, and harnessed to it a little donkey, not much bigger than a big retriever. In this chair sat a fat little dwarf. He was as richly dressed as the king, but because of his fatness and because he was sitting hunched up in cushions, the effect was quite different. It made him look like a shapeless bundle of fur and silk and velvet. He was as old as the king, but more hale and hearty, with very keen eyes. His bare head, which was bald and extremely large, shone like a gigantic billiard ball in the sunset light. Further back, in a half-circle, stood what Jill knew at once to be the courtiers. They were well worth looking for their clothes and armor alone. As far as that went, they were really more like looking at a flower bed than at a crowd. But what really made Jill open her eyes and mouth as wide as they would go was the people themselves, if people was the right word. For only about 1 in every 5 was human. The rest of the things you would never see in our world. Fauns, satyrs, centurions. Jill could give a name to these, for she had seen pictures of them. Dwarfs too, and there were a lot of animals she knew well. Bears, badgers, moles, leopards, mice, and various birds. But then they were so different from the animals from which those of the same names in England. Some of them were much bigger. The mice, for instance, stood on their hind legs and were over 2 feet high. But quite apart from that, they all looked different. You could see the expression in their face, that they could talk and think just as well as you could. Golly, thought Jill, so it's true after all. But the next moment she added, I wonder, are they friendly? For she had just noticed on the outskirts of the crowd 1 or 2 giants and some of the people who she couldn't name at all. At that moment, Aslan and the signs rushed back into her mind. She had forgotten all about them in the last half hour. Scrub, she whispered, grabbing his arm. Scrub, quick! Do you see anyone you know? So you've turned up again, have you? Said Scrub disagreeably, for which he had some reason. Well, keep quiet, can't you? I want to listen. Don't be a fool, said Jill. There isn't a moment to lose. Can't you see some old friends here? Because you've got to go and speak to them at once. What are you talking about? Said Scrub. It's Aslan. The lion says you've got to, said Jill despairingly. I've seen him. Oh, you have you? What did he say? He said the very first person you saw in Narnia would be an old friend, and you got to speak to him at once. Well, there's nobody hero I've ever seen in my life before, and anyway, I don't know whether this is Narnia." "Thought you said you'd been here before," said Jill. "Well, you got that wrong then." "Well, I like that. You told me, for heaven's sake, dry up and let's hear what they're saying." The king was speaking to the dwarf, but Jill couldn't hear what he said, and as far as she could make out, the dwarf made no answer, though it nodded and wagged its head a great deal. Then the king raised his voice, and addressed the whole court, but his voice was so old and crackled that she could understand very little of his speech, especially since it was all about the people and places she had never heard of. When the speech was over, the king stooped down and kissed the dwarf on both cheeks, straightened himself, raised his right hand as if in blessing, and went slowly and with feeble steps up the gangway and on board the ship for his departure. Handkerchiefs were out, sounds of sobbing were heard in every direction. The gangway was cast off, trumpets sounded from the poop, and the ship moved away from the quay. It was being towed by a rowing boat, but Jill didn't see that. "Now," said Scrub, but he didn't get any further because at that moment a large white object, Jill thought for a second that it was a kite, came gliding through the air and alighted to its feet. It was a white owl, but so big that it stood as high as a good-sized dwarf. It blinked and peered as if it were short-sighted, and put its head on its side, and said in a soft, hooting kind of voice, "Too-hoo, too-hoo, who are you two?" "My name's Scrub, and this is Pull," said Eustace. "Would you mind telling us where we are?" "In the land of Narnia, the king's palace of Cair-Paravel." "Is that the king who's just taken ship?" "Too-choo, too-choo, too-choo, too-choo," said the owl sadly, shaking its big head. "But who are you? There's something magic about you two. I saw you arrive. You flew. Everyone else is so busy speaking the king off that nobody knew. Except me. I happened to notice you. You flew." "We were sent here by Aslan," said Eustace in a low voice. "Too-hoo, too-hoo," said the owl, ruffling its feathers. "That's almost too much for me. So early in the evening. I'm not quite myself till the sun's down." "And we've been sent to find the lost prince," said Jill, who had been anxiously waiting to get into the conversation. "Well, it's the first I've heard about it," said Eustace. "What prince?" "You'd better come and speak to the Lord Regent at once," it said. "That's him, over there in the donkey carriage, Trumpkin the dwarf." The bird turned and began leading it the way, muttering to itself, "Hoo-to-hoo, what to do? I can't think clearly yet, it's too early." "What is the king's name?" said Eustace to the owl. "Caspian the 10th, said the owl. And Jill wondered why Scrub had suddenly pulled up the short walk and turned into an extraordinary color. She thought that she had never seen him look so sick about anything. Before she had time to ask any questions, they had reached the dwarf, who was just gathering up the reins of the donkey and preparing to drive back to the castle. The crowd of courtiers had broken up and were going in the same direction, by ones and twos and little knots, like people coming away from watching a game or race. "To-hoo! Ahem! Lord Regent!" said the owl, stooping over a little and holding its beak near the dwarf's ear. "Hey? What's that?" said the dwarf. "To strangers, my lord," said the owl. "Rangers? What do you mean?" said the dwarf. "I see two uncommonly grubby man-cubs. What do they want?" "My name's Jill," said Jill, pressing forward. She was very eager to explain the important business on which they had come. "The girl's called Jill," said the owl, as loud as he could. "What's that?" said the dwarf. "The girls are killed? I don't believe a word of it. What girls? Who killed them?" "Only one girl, my lord," said the owl. "Her name is Jill." Speak up, said the dwarf. "Don't stand there buzzing and twittering in my ear. Who's been killed?" "Nobody's been killed," hooted the owl. "Who?" "Nobody." All right. You don't need to shout. I'm not so deaf as all that. What do you mean by coming here and telling me that nobody's been killed? Why should anyone have been killed?" "Better tell him I'm Eustace," said Scrub. "The boy's Eustace, my lord." hooted the owl as loud as he could. Useless? Said the dwarf, eager to believe. I dare say he is. Is there any reason for bringing him to court? Hey! Not useless, said the owl. Eustace! Used to it, is he? I don't know what you're talking about, I'm sure. I'll tell you what it is, Master Glimfeather. While I was a young dwarf, there used to be talking beasts and birds in this country who could really talk. There wasn't all this mumbling and muttering and whispering. It wouldn't have been tolerated for a moment. Not for a moment. Sir Ernest, my trumpet, please. A little fawn, who had been standing quietly beside the dwarf's elbow all the time, now handed him a silver-eared trumpet. It was made like the musical instrument called a serpent, so that the tube curled right round the dwarf's neck. While he was getting it settled the owl. Glimmerfeather suddenly said to the children in a whisper, My brain's a bit clearer now. Don't say anything about the lost prince. I'll explain later. It wouldn't do to who, or what to do. Now, said the dwarf, if you have anything sensible to say, Master Glimfeather, try to speak. Take a deep breath, and don't attempt to speak too quickly. With the help of the children, and in spite of a fit of coughing on the part of the dwarf, Glimfeather explained the strangers had been sent by Aslan to visit the court of Narnia. The dwarf glanced quickly up at them with a new expression in his eyes. Sent by the lion himself, eh? He said. And from that other place, beyond the worlds, eh? Yes, my lord, bawled Eustace into the trumpet. Son of Adam and daughter of Eve, eh? Said the dwarf. But the people at Experiment House hadn't heard of Adam and Eve, so Jill and Eustace couldn't answer that. But the dwarf didn't seem to notice. Well, my dears, he said, taking first one and then the other by the hand and bowing his head a little, you are a very hearty welcome. If the good king, my poor master, had not come this very hour set sail for 7 Isles, he would have been glad of your coming. It would have brought him back to his youth for a moment. And now it is high time for supper. You should tell me of your business in full council tomorrow morning. Master Glimfeather see the bedchambers in suitable clothes, and all else is provided for these guests in the most honorable fashion. And Glimfeather, in your ear. Here the dwarf put his mouth close to the owl's head, and no doubt intended to whisper. But like other deaf people, he wasn't very good judgment of his own voice, and both children heard him say, See that they're properly washed. After that, the dwarf touched up his donkey, and set off towards the castle at something between a trot and a waddle. It was a very fat little beast. While the fawn and the owl and the children followed at a rather slower pace, the sun had set and the air was growing cold. They went across the lawn and then through an orchard, and so to the north gate of Cair Paravel, which stood wide open. Inside they found a grassy courtyard. Lights were already showing from the windows of the great hall on the right, and from a more complicated mass of buildings straight ahead. Into these the owl led them, and there was a most delightful person who was called to look after Jill. She was not much taller than Jill herself, and a good deal slenderer, but obviously fully grown, graceful as a willow, and her hair was willowy too, and there seemed to be some moss in it. She brought Jill to a round table in one of the turrets, where there was a little bath sunk in the floor, and a fire of sweet-smelling woods burning on the flat hearth, as a lamp hanging by a silver chain from the vaulted roof. The windows looked west from the strange land of Narnia, and Jill saw the red remains of the sunset still blowing behind distant mountains. It made her long for more adventures, and feel surely that this was only the beginning. When she had had her bath, she brushed her hair and put on the clothes they had laid out for her. They were the kind that not only felt nice, but looked nice and smelled nice and made nice sounds when you moved as well. She would have gone back to gazing at the exciting window, but she was interrupted by a banging on the door. "Come in," said Jill, and in came Scrub, also bathed and splendidly dressed in Narnian clothes. but his face didn't look like he was enjoying it. "Oh, here you are at last," he said crossly, flinging himself into the chair. "I've been trying to find you for ever so long." "Well, now you have," said Jill. "I say, Scrub, isn't it simply too exciting and scrumptious for words?" She had forgotten all about the science and the lost prince for the moment. "Oh, that's what you think this is?" said Scrub, and then after a pause, "I wish to goodness we'd never come." "Why on earth?" "I can't bear it," said Scrub, "seeing the King Caspian, adoring an old man like that. It's frightful." "Why, what harm does it do to you?" "Oh, you don't understand. Now that I've come to think of it, you couldn't. I didn't tell you that this world had a different time from ours." "How do you mean?" "The time you spend here doesn't take up any of our time. Don't you see? I mean, however long we spend here, we shall get back to Experimental House at the moment we left it." "That won't be much fun." "Oh, dry up. Do keep interrupting. And when you're back in England, in our world, you can't tell how long time is here. It might be any number of years in Narnia, and we'll be having one year at home. The Pevensies explained it all to me, but like a fool I forgot about it. And now apparently it's been about 70 years, Narnian years, since I was here last. Do you see now? And I come back and find Caspian an old man. An old man. Then the king was an old friend of yours?" said Jill. A horrid thought had struck her. "I shall jolly well think he was," said Scrub miserably. "About as good of a friend a chap could have. And last time he was only a few years older than me. And to see that old man with the white beard, and to remember Caspian as he was the morning we captured the Lone Islands, or the fight with the sea serpent, oh, it's frightful. It's worse than coming back and finding him dead." "Oh, shut up," said Jill impatiently. "It's far worse than you think. We've muffed the first sign." Of course, Scrub did not understand this. Then Jill told him about her conversation with Aslan and the 4 signs in the task of finding the lost prince, which had been laid upon them. "So you see," she wound up, "you did see an old friend, just as Aslan said, and you ought to have gone and spoken to him at once. And you haven't, and everything is going to be wrong from the very beginning." "But how was I to know?" said Scrub. "If only you'd listened to me when I tried to tell you, we'd be all right," said Jill. "Yes, and if you hadn't played the fool on the edge of the cliff and jolly near murdered me." "All right, I said murder, and I'll say it again as often as I like, so keep your hair on. We have to come together and both know what to do." "I suppose he was the very first person you saw," said Jill. "You must have been here hours before me. Are you sure you didn't see anyone else first?" "I was only here about a minute before you," said Scrub. "He must have blown you quicker than me, making up for lost time, the time you lost." "Don't be a perfect beast, Scrub," said Jill. "Hello, what's that?" It was the castle bell ringing for supper, and thus what looked like it was turning into the first-rate quarrel was happily cut short. Both had a good appetite by this time. Supper in the great hall of castles was the most splendid thing either of them had ever seen. For though Eustace had been in their world before, he had spent his whole visit at sea, and knew nothing of the glory and the courtesy of the Narnians at home in their own land. The banners hung from the roof, and each course came with trumpeters and kettle drums. There were soups that would make your mouth water to think of, and the lovely fishes called pavenders, and venison, and peacock, and pies, and icings, and jellies, and fruits and nuts, and all manner of wines and fruit drinks. Even Eustace cheered up and admitted that it was something like. And when it had all the serious eating and drinking was over, a blind poet came forward and struck up the grand old tale of Prince Cor and Avarice and the horse breed, which is called The Horse and His Boy, and tells of an adventure that happened in Narnia and Carolman and the lands between, in the Golden Age when Peter was High King in Cair Paravel. I haven't the time to tell it now, though it was well worth hearing. When they were dragging themselves upstairs to bed, yawning their heads off, Jill said, "I bet we'll sleep tonight," for it had been a full day, which just shows how little anyone knows what is going to happen to them next. The end of chapter 3.